Oh, it's good to see so many of you guys here, including some familiar faces I've seen recently, as well as some friends I haven't seen in a little while. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this finds you all well, wherever you're joining us from today. As we're getting up and going, just do us a favor, go ahead and put in that little Zoom chat box where you're joining us from, because we have reason to believe that we've got folks zooming in from all over the place. For those of you I haven't met, I think I look at the little boxes here, I think I know almost everyone. For those I haven't met though, I'm Terry Babcock-Loomish. I serve as the Executive Secretary of the Truman Foundation and CEO of Friends of Truman. As a reminder, Friends is the nonprofit partner of the Truman Foundation, America's living memorial to President Truman, and our national monument to public service. This spring, we met 193 remarkable Truman finalists, some of whom are joining us here right now. And just last week, we announced our 62 newest Trumans from across the country. These are leaders who share a commitment to public service, and I am just thrilled to see some of you all with us. Our 2021 class represents what is really the future of public service. This is a diverse cohort working on most every issue turning in our headlines, from public health, criminal justice reform, the climate crisis, and yes, making our communities and our institutions fair and more accessible for everyone, regardless of ability. According to the World Bank, 15% of our population experiences some form of disability. So I'm really grateful to Tyler Hatch and Jory Fleming for taking the initiative to convene today's conversation about how we can all take steps toward a more inclusive society. Many of you will have heard a terrific interview on NPR's Weekend Edition with our 2016 South Carolina Truman. Jory's forthcoming book is How to Be Human, an Autistic Man's Guide to Life. Joining Jory today are 2014 Virginia Truman Teresa Danso-Danquah, the NextGen Initiatives Manager at Disability In. This is a nonprofit focused on disability inclusion for businesses. 2016 Illinois Truman Zoie Sheets, who's taking time out from her med school training right now. She focuses on leadership development for the Inclusive Collective, which partners internationally on infrastructural change for individuals with disabilities. And finally, representing the class of 2020, New Jersey Truman and Landre, fellow at the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies and commissioner of ANC2E right here in DC. Unfortunately, Jay Ruckelshaus is not going to join us today, but I want to put Ramp Less Traveled on your radar, as he does just terrific work supporting students with spinal cord injuries. I'm going to turn the conversation over to Jory, but first I'll remind you that we will have time for Q&A, so feel free to post any questions you might have for our panelists in that Zoom chat. Okay, Jory, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here and to have a conversation with the panelists that we have today. And we also collectively look forward to your questions. So feel free to put those into the chat window as they occur, and we'll have time and space to come back to those at the end of our conversation. Before we begin our conversation, I just wanted to share a quote that I read recently from a book called Disability Visibility. Disabled people have always existed, whether the word disability is used or not. To me, disability is not a monolith, nor is it a clear-cut binary of disabled and non-disabled. Disability is mutable and ever-evolving. Disability is both apparent and non-apparent. Disability is pain, struggle, brilliance, abundance, and joy. Disability is socio-political, cultural, and biological. Being visible and claiming a disabled identity brings risks as much as it brings pride. Now, I'm very excited to be here with a fantastic group of Truman scholars and to have this important discussion with you all today. Before we get started, we have an access statement that Anna has offered to make for us. If she's available to do so, or if not, I can do so for, excellent.
Yes, I am.
Over to you, Anna.
Sorry, everyone. My fire alarms are being tested today, so I might be inside and outside. But on behalf of the panel, I want to invite everyone here to let us know at any time if any of your access needs are not being met so that we can adjust accordingly. And I also want to welcome all of you to be present for the next hour, however is most accessible or comfortable for you. So this might mean grabbing a snack and a glass of water, turning off your camera, taking breaks, listening while resting in bed, or something else that feels right to you. And if you're in person, I would invite you to enter and leave the room as you needed, just sprawl out on the floor if you wanted, and make yourself comfortable in any number of ways. I think it's really important when we're talking about disability justice to remember that our bodies and minds are not machines, and that we should adjust our activities to meet their needs. So we want to really practice that here.
Thank you, Anna. And the title of our panel conversation today is Fostering Inclusive Communities, Perspectives on Disability Experience, Policy, and Advocacy. And to start our conversation, I'd like to give each of our panelists a moment to introduce themselves or their work, and an initial remark or thought that they'd like to share with you on the subject of our panel this afternoon. And whoever likes to go first, you can just jump straight on in.
Hi, everyone. This is Teresa Danso-Danquah. I am the Virginia Scholar from 2014, and it's great to be here with you all. I currently work at Disability In, which is a nonprofit that serves Fortune 500 companies, being able to provide disability inclusion and talent resources to increase disability inclusion in the workplace. I serve as the manager of our NextGen initiatives, which is our programming for students in college and also recent graduates with disabilities to be able to jumpstart their careers and land a job after graduation. And I come to this space both as an ally and then turned self-advocate. My journey has taken me from back when I was applying for the Truman Scholarship many moons ago to then also embracing both my own identity as a person with a disability and also as someone who has an older sister with an intellectual disability. And so this topic is something that's personal for me, it's academic, it's social political, it's everything and beyond. And I'm really excited for this conversation. I think to Jory's question about the title today, I think there's many ways to come to the disability community. We're probably the most inclusive community in that you can be of any race, gender, socioeconomic class, status. And yet at the same time, while there's about 61 million Americans and almost 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide, there's still a lot of work to be done in true inclusion in our communities and our workplaces. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we have today, and really, as Anna mentioned earlier, really invite you to add your comments to the chat, make sure that you're comfortable and engage with us during this time.
My name is Zoe. I'm a 2016 scholar from Illinois. And as was mentioned earlier, I'm currently in med school. So today is our clinical skills training day. So just finished learning how to take blood and now joining this call. So really grateful to be spending my lunch break with everyone here. A little background about me. I became disabled when I was about 11 or 12. And did not claim that word at all until I got to college and met some of the incredible disability activists in Chicago through our Disability Resource Center, Access Living, all kinds of incredible spaces. And I realized that not only was it a word that I could claim, but it was a word that I deeply wanted to claim. I wanted a way to kind of capture how having a body and mind that works like mine influenced my view of the world, my view of self, view of others. And so it grew from not just kind of an identity marker, but something that was, as has been named already, was socio-political. It influenced everything. Through that journey, I realized I didn't know if I wanted to be a doctor because I was learning all the ways that the medical community has harmed people with disabilities. And so I actually, through applying for the Truman, reflected a lot on that and decided to get a master's of public health first so I could continue that personal exploration. Realized actually I should become a doctor precisely because I was disabled and realized the medical community could be harmful. And so right now I focus on two main areas in my research and advocacy. First, in making sure that medical school is accessible for disabled students, so that the workforce better represents the people that it is serving. And then also training physicians, because we know there are policies that address, they don't always address it well, but they at least address the physical and financial accessibility of medicine. But there is very little addressing physician attitudes and the way that they impact patients. So that's kind of my other area of focus. Thanks for organizing this, Jory and Tyler. Good to be here with y'all.
And I'm Anna. I use she and her pronouns. I'm calling in from DC today. I'm a student at Georgetown University, which is where I am right now, and a 2020 scholar from New Jersey. And I work a lot on trying to push one of the many missions of disability justice, which is that disability is just a natural and often beautiful and revolutionary and path-breaking form of human diversity, and that there is no neutral standard body from which our bodies deviate. So I think a lot of what I try and do is cultural work to try and push us towards that realization and to adjust the way that the world works accordingly, to bring in those whose bodies have been deemed defective, deviant, disordered, disabled, and adjust our world to fit that full spectrum of human diversity. And I've lately in COVID been working a lot on pandemic relief policies that are inclusive of the disability community, pushing against things like medical rationing, against the idea that disabled people are expected losses in disasters writ large. And in the past, I've also done some work on Medicaid policy here at Georgetown. I specialize in disability policy in Latin America and the US. So that's where I'm coming from academically. And then a lot of my disability work is also rooted in nonviolent direct action. I work with a disability protest group. And what we do is we often go out to the Capitol or go out and block roads and do sit-ins and push for these policy changes, while also doing the cultural and social work to make those policy changes real, to make those rights real. Because I think something that we're going to talk about throughout this group is how we've gotten kind of far on the rights piece, on the rights on paper. Now, how do we get those to really, truly create inclusion in practice? So thank you for having me.
Thank you all for being here and for sharing your introductions with us. And I'm really excited to start this conversation with you all. And the first question that I'd like to pose, it is about this concept of bodies, which all three of you mentioned in some way in your answer. And so my question is, what does disability identity reveal about our relationship to our bodies and to our minds?
I'll jump in, Jory. I think that for me, the number one thing that being disabled has taught me is that relationships to bodies are really complex. I often hear kind of in the disability justice world, this pushback on the idea of seeking a cure. And that makes total sense to me, particularly for some types of disabilities. There are many autistic self-advocates who, push back on the idea of curing autism. And there are so many examples of when that is appropriate and makes total sense. There are also people like me whose disabilities, the main aspect is chronic pain. And so for me, I am both proud of how my body works, but I also feel mad sometimes at the way my body works and the way it's kind of flaring up. There are moments that I can do some things and the next day maybe I can't do that thing. Sometimes that doesn't bother me and sometimes it feels frustrating. It is constantly changing and constantly evolving, sometimes multiple times within one day. So I think to me, I have had to learn how to be at peace with that complexity, how to communicate that complexity to people so that they understand that, you know, one day you may see me taking stairs, but the next day I'm not lying when I tell you I can't. You know, figuring out how to capture that complexity for other people, as well as in my interpersonal everyday interactions, my interactions with patients, interaction with self, even my interactions with my home, my pets. Yeah, the word that comes to mind for me is it is just complex, and we as a society need to be better at holding space for that complexity and hearing people when they express their complex relationship with their body. Yeah.
This is Teresa. I definitely want to echo what Zoe mentioned. I think the complexity is something that I kind of constantly struggle with, and many of the students that I serve as well. I think there's a perception both of what society thinks that a person with a disability should look like, and for someone like me with an invisible disability or non-visible disability, it's kind of hard to balance on those days when you are going through an episode and you do need to take time, but then in a couple of weeks you're neurotypical appearing to other people, and so something that I think the diversity community often forgets is that disability falls into diversity, but then also vice versa. There's also diversity within the disability community too. And unfortunately, our community, and I speak of the disability community kind of writ large, is predominantly led by a lot of the white activists. And I think someone that I heard speak recently kind of mentioned that we're overlooking oftentimes people of color in the disability space who are often grappling with, internalized ableism from our own racial communities, but also then with how society views us externally as well. So it's almost like a double consciousness, to quote W. Du Bois. But that's something that I think there's work still to be done on the attitudinal perceptions that I think Anna mentioned earlier of just changing communities' understanding of disability. But I think also it happens on a personal level too. And sometimes you wonder, it's the chicken and the egg, like if society is more accepting, will we accept our own selves? But I think there's often work that I always encourage kind of the students that I mentor is that really understanding, seeing that disability, as Anna mentioned, is part of the natural human diversity. And then also seeing that there is strength in our disability. I think for me, I've had to navigate, inaccessible environments, especially in the workplace, which is kind of the area of arena that I work in. And often that's given us a strength to be able to be adaptable, be able to think quick on our feet, and be able to navigate complex systems. And so I'm really helping some of the students that I work with to recognize that our disability is our strength. And then how do we move forward there of, acting in the confidence that we don't need to have society to be ready to accept us to live in our true identities.
Yeah, I also want to highlight the fact that disability is so socially constructed, like gender, like race, that it is so intertwined with the structures of power that exist in society at a given time in a given place. For example, until very recently, being gay was pathologized. It was viewed as a disability. In the 1960s, Black men were being diagnosed with something called protest psychosis. Wanting to go out and protest for your rights was pathologized, was viewed as a disability. And, things that we view as disabilities here in the US, for example, epilepsy, can be viewed quite differently in other cultures. For example, among the Hmong in China, that's not a disability. That's not something wrong that you treat with medicine and try to fix. It's a spiritual experience. And so all of these things are very mutable, very constructed and dependent on the power structures in your time and place. And that doesn't mean they're not real. They're very real. These are different parts of the human experience. This is diversity. But it also calls us, I think, to interrogate the ways that we're processing and treating those differences, and encourages us to look at how we can do that better and in a more inclusive way.
Yeah, and Zoe, when you were talking about complexity, that definitely impacts me as well as someone with more than one disability, some physical and some invisible, like Teresa was mentioning. And I definitely want to return back to the thing that you brought up about how sort of attitudes in society shapes these that other panelists touched on. But both Teresa and Anna both spoke to this sort of idea, whether it's power or whether it's workplaces or and otherwise spaces, that disability identity comes into contact with whether it's power, whether it's workplace hierarchies. And so I'm wanting to spend some time there, and just by asking, what do you wish could be different when it comes to these spaces? Whether it's sort of power and public policy, or whether it's the workplaces or school environments that we have to interact with on a day-to-day level.
One thing that's coming to mind for me is so many initiatives in these places or things surrounding disability are not led by disabled people. We're not given the opportunity to talk about ourselves and what we want. Instead, they're viewed as projects by non-disabled people that are charitable. And you know, those are done with the best of intentions. They really are. And I truly believe that a lot of non-disabled people see the plight that people with disabilities are going through and want to help. The problem is in assuming that you have the expertise to help and talking over sometimes people with the lived experience. So I really wish that we could acknowledge, you know, collectively as a society, that the place to go first is to disabled people to ask us what we want and how we want it and how you can be a good ally in that. And then I also wish that in these spaces, disability wasn't so co-opted for morality points. I think that's really big in politics. A lot of politicians kind of use disabled people for morality points, like, look, I'm helping the poor, sad, disabled people. And it's like, well, the disabled people wouldn't be poor and sad if you just afforded us equality, afforded us a place to speak our voice. And I think that those two, the protagonism and the viewing us as full three-dimensional humans rather than charity projects, would go a long way in these spaces towards making disability a more respected identity issue and making concrete, you know, progress towards our equality.
I love that, Anna. I was like nodding my head, agreeing with all that you're mentioning. I think just the quote that comes to mind that's often repeated in the disability community is "nothing about us without us," and that's something that's like very important to us. I think from some of the evolution of the forms of disability, I guess cultural understanding and the models of disability, from medical to social to charity model that Anna mentioned, and I think there's just this misunderstanding that we have to do for and not with the disability community. And so that's something that, you know, I really strive to help the companies that we work with at Disability and understand is that there's just often preconceived notions of what, you know, the students that we work with disabilities are capable of doing and the types of jobs that they're capable of having. And it's often that they're underestimating our talent. And this also happens for people of color without disabilities as well. And, you know, as a Black disabled queer woman, like I see the kind of intersectionality that companies are missing out on when they don't tap into the disability community. You know, there's people of color who are also disabled. There's queer people who are also disabled, and you're missing out a huge talented population when you don't see that as an area to be an asset to your company. So that's kind of a little bit on the workplace, but also on the personal level, I think there's just more work to be done to kind of like Anna said, to make sure you're considering who is the protagonist in your story. I think there's moves right now to have Hollywood really have accurate representation of people with disabilities in movies and TV shows. I mean, I can't think of many other identities where we have non-disabled actors acting in wheelchairs or pretending to be disabled in a movie or TV show. And there's plenty of disability actors out there, but we're just not tapped into. And then also just fighting for that inclusion on the personal level too. I think there's just areas where we think that I think it's top of mind for me in terms of the season that we're in for, I don't know if high schools are still having this, but you know, it's prom season, at least it was pre-COVID. And there's a lot of times where the protagonists of these kind of great grand gestures are often that, you know, a non-disabled person is taking a student with disability to prom, and you know, who gets the attention? It's that non-disabled person, you know, being the bigger person or whatever it might be to like do the right thing and help this disabled person go to prom. And the same thing happens on sports teams and other areas. And I think back to just echo the complexity, I do understand and know plenty of families who see that as an amazing opportunity for their son and their daughter to get that chance to go to prom, get that chance to score a basketball three-pointer, you know, in a game. But at the same time, I think there's many more of us in the disability community that don't come from that parent model that really want to make sure the story is focused on the person with disability. So nothing about us without us.
Echoing all of that, yes. I also think one thing I want to note is in so many spaces, and I should note one of the reasons this feels so like near and dear to me is there are some days when I am completely invisibly disabled, some days I use a cane, and some days I use a wheelchair. And so I've kind of seen the way that the public interaction with me shifts based off of those things. And I don't remember who coined this term. So if anyone knows, please help me credit the right person. But there's this term called the Circle of Politeness that I was introduced to years ago in undergrad that I really wish we could address in workplaces, in spaces that I'm in, like hospitals and clinics, but also just in like everyday life. The Circle of Politeness, meaning that when I use my wheelchair, I notice that people are significantly less willing to engage with me, period. But if they are engaging with me, it's usually to offer assistance, to open a door, or to ask me a really intrusive question about my body and why it works or looks the way it does. When I am invisibly disabled, however, people will chat with me while I'm in the checkout line. They will, you know, smile at me when I am walking down the street. There's just a completely different approach to me being a fellow human being existing in the same space when I am not only visibly versus invisibly disabled, but even the spectrum, the difference between the cane and the wheelchair. So that's one thing that came to mind. Another thing that came to mind for me and was continuing to come up as I listened to the other panelists speak is also how much work we need to do to kind of shift the burden and figuring out how to do that without stripping away the input of disabled folks. And I say that because, you know, if we think about a lot of the policies that exist around disability, many of them say, here's the standard you must meet, but if you don't meet it, nothing will happen to you unless a disabled person takes on the burden of suing you, which not only assumes that the disabled person has the time, money, energy, and desire to sue, but also that they feel safe and healthy interacting with a legal system, which is simply not true for the large majority of disabled folks, particularly disabled folks of color. So when we continue making policies that say the implementation is fully dependent on the willingness of a disabled person to tackle this massive thing, it's no wonder people still go to the doctor's office and don't have an exam table they can actually get on. It's no wonder we have stores. The only coffee shop in my neighborhood is not wheelchair accessible. Like, it's no wonder that we are still in this state when we are only making policy and not strategically implementing it as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. There's a number of ways we could go with that. But where I want to go next is in Anna's introduction, she mentioned that, inclusion on paper is different from either inclusion in practice or, as all of you have mentioned, in societal attitudes or hearts and minds is how I like to think of it. And I'm just going to, for those watching, I'm going to put an interesting article from South Carolina into the chat about paying equally disabled people. South Carolina is almost there, I think, in terms of eliminating substandard wages. But I'm wondering if you all would like to speak to this question of how do we move from inclusion on paper and sort of these legal fights, these rights, to changing society, to fostering inclusion when it comes to people's hearts and minds.
I think Zoe gave a really good answer to this in her last response. And I think to expand upon it, I want to highlight the difference between the disability rights movement and the disability justice movement. So the disability rights movement looks at the problems that disabled people face and says, we should fix this with a law. We should put in a law that says you can't treat disabled people poorly. And so the prescription is, there are these structures of power in society. We want disabled people to have access to that power. And the disability justice movement, which emerged in the early 2000s mostly, looked at that and said, laws are very important. We agree. But a lot of the laws we have aren't working because those laws are not addressing the root of the problem. They're not addressing ableism. They're only addressing ableism's symptoms, which might be lack of employment, lack of accommodations, things like that. And they also highlighted the fact that if your prescription is to allow disabled people into existing structures of power, you're not looking at the ways in which those structures are unjust in and of themselves. We should be trying to break them down rather than just saying, oh, well, why don't you include us too? We want that power too. And so rights-based strategies, I think, only address the symptoms of inequality and not the root. And so you get these rights on paper and not in practice, and they're especially only on paper for folks who are multi-marginalized, who are queer and disabled, Black and disabled, etc. And so that even widens the gap in inequality. And so disability justice really is practicing and telling us that we have to kind of change our culture. We have to look at the way capitalism only values people for productivity. And we need to look at the way eugenics says we should eliminate the people who are more of a burden on our system. And we need to change those things in our culture to really make these rights real, to really get equality in practice and equity.
I was also going to bring up disability justice, so I have nothing to add there. It was captured beautifully, and I added the primer, the disability justice primer from Sins Invalid, into the chat for anyone who wants to see it. The only thing I will add to that is also the power of stories. I was recently interviewed by ABC, and they asked me, what is your favorite example of a disabled character in TV who has more of a story than being disabled? And the amount of time it took me to think of an example was astounding. And I wish that that only happened on television. I wish that it was just, the way we portray people on TV, people with disabilities on TV, made them disabled and nothing else. But that's also how it is in real life in many, many cases. I had an example happen to me early on in medical school when I was talking to someone who I was just getting to know, and I mentioned that I was queer to them. And clearly without thinking, they immediately took it back. But they said, oh, I thought you were disabled. And we had a whole conversation afterwards where I kind of explained to them that it's common for people to have other parts of their identity either lessened, viewed differently, ignored, etc., because of their disability. So Jory, to kind of use your phrase of like changing people's hearts and minds, I think if we could tell the stories of our lives and have disability, sure, be a component because it shapes every aspect of my life, right? Like there is no Zoie without that. But if I could talk about things other than disability and people not kind of constantly have this lens of like sometimes it feels like people don't even hear me because they're still trying to process that I am more than disabled before they can even hear the rest of my story. So yeah, I would just add the power of storytelling and story sharing, which is also something that the founders of disability justice have named as a really powerful tool too.
Yeah, now that we're on Zoom, I get this really weird dilemma of getting to choose whether or not to out myself as disabled because I'm a wheelchair user full time. So everything that Zoie was saying about how people interact really weirdly with wheelchair users, I experience that all the time, except when I'm on Zoom and people can't tell that I'm a wheelchair user. So I make this calculation. I find myself making this calculation of, do I out myself as a wheelchair user? And then I'm like, and also, do I out myself as queer? And like, how are these identities going to interact? If I out myself as both, is that too much? Am I overwhelming people? And it's a very interesting way to think because we aren't, you know, keeping in mind that intersectionality. And that's another big critique of disability justice, that you have to center that or you're not going to solve anything. All of your solutions are going to be incomplete.
Yeah, I definitely want to echo what Anna and Zoe have so eloquently already articulated. I think what I was going to start out first is just that you kind of need a both and approach. Like laws are still needed at the end of the day, even though lately I've been just like, what does rule of law mean anyway? But at the same time, like I've seen that, you know, what gets tracked and measured gets done. And particularly in the workplace with recent legislation back in 2014 of Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which now, you know, requires affirmative action plans and measurement of disability inclusion in the workplace by federal contractors and the companies across the U.S. And so we've been working with companies who were first, you know, just bewildered of what to do. You know, like, where can you find people with disabilities? And it's like, have you really asked your population? You currently have many people who don't feel psychologically safe to expose or come out as disabled, but also many who've had to, you know, not take jobs because it wasn't physically accessible to even show up for the interview. And so we've been working with companies to just be able to understand, you know, that meeting laws and compliance is the floor. That's the minimum level of expectation of inclusion. We're trying to find out what's the ceiling, how far high can we go? And there is no limit. And so that's something that I think is still needed, because I think that's unfortunately where many of society is, that what is in a law they will not comply with until they're facing the litigation, which there are so many great disability advocates and disability rights lawyers out there. But at the same time, I think stories are definitely needed, but also stories that avoid inspiration porn, I think, is another common phrase that many people might not have been exposed to. So this is kind of the, I guess one, I wouldn't even do justice to it if I don't mention Stella's TED Talk, and I'm forgetting her last name, so if anyone remembers it, remind me, but she has a great TED Talk on inspiration porn, so I really encourage people to go watch that. But she just really articulates this idea that essentially, like, people with disabilities are often seen in this monolith of like, oh my gosh, you got out of bed, like, that is amazing, let's celebrate you. Like, oh my gosh, you like were able to make coffee one day. And like, some of those achievements are very real and are very momentous in one's life, but there's so many more. Thank you for adding that TED Talk, great. Stella Young, that was her last name. So there's just so much more to a person with disability besides these minimum level of expectations that we put on our community. and people ourselves. I know that I've seen this, up close through my sister's experiences with the education system of what, they expected people with intellectual disabilities to be able to do, more or less people in the workplace. And so moving beyond those stories to the real lived experience. So to kind of circle an earlier point, just really centering a person with a disability and all the many achievements that they have without delving into this idea that they're an inspiration just for living, because the other side of that coin is that you're actually just praising them because they're going through something that you would never wish upon yourself. But you're so grateful to not be non-disabled, to not be disabled, and not to have to experience that. And so I think that's one way that we can move beyond compliance, is echoing and celebrating those stories. And I'd be remiss to also not mention that we're facing that same thing in the Black community. I think, everyone knows the events that have gone on this week, and I think it's really hard, especially for me personally, just to be able to find Black joy, or just joy, resilience, happiness in my life, and all around me there's death by the hands of our state and people who are supposed to be protecting and serving us. But at the same time, we're, as a community, and I'm referring to the Black community, we are more than just those videos of lynchings that are modern day that are still happening. We're more than just, mugshots. We are more than just all the tragedy that happens in our community. We also have joy. We also have happiness. With so much more, and I want our communities to also highlight that.
Awesome. I have one final question for all of our panelists to address. And as a reminder, as we enter into this sort of last question, will be followed by a time of Q&A. And so if you've been sort of mulling over some questions while we're in the last phase of our conversation before Q&A, now would be the time to start sending those in. Something to look forward to. But we've talked a bit about ableism, and Teresa, you mentioned how other communities are part of the disability community, but of course there are other isms which can make tackling ableism all the more challenging. But as we move into the Q&A, there's a lot of people listening into our conversation that are members of various communities in the United States or in other countries. But how would you suggest that a community member could work against ableism in their communities?
I might start, if that's okay, by reading my favorite definition of ableism by Talila Lewis.
Excellent.
And they're the coolest. You should definitely look up some of their stuff. So ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce or produce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism.
I love that quote by Talia. So thank you so much. I'm so glad we got to get that in. I think what I would echo to Jory's question is that it does start on a personal level. I think everyone should be evaluating the ways that they have been or actively are ableist, and how to actively, be non-ableist. And I think one of the ways is to really also seek out many authors that are out there who are sharing their experiences and educating others, on their own time, while they're actively also just trying to live their lives. I think one great writer that I would love to just amplify is Emily Ladau, just great writer, just kind of talking about, I think she's a forthcoming book too, about, how to navigate just talking about disability, and even just how do you talk about it to your kids, and how do you understand it for yourself. And so definitely want to amplify her work. And then the other person who is coming from an intersectional perspective that I love and work closely with is Carrie Gray, and really understanding where racial justice intersects with disability justice. And so Learning is one thing, but also acting is another. So being able to call out or call in or whatever you want to call it, when you do see things that are happening around you, just being more aware. And I think the thing that I always mention to companies is really just having a greater mindset for who's not in the room. Oftentimes, I think disability is always left out, as I mentioned earlier, in diversity conversations, in the workplace, and in every conversation. And so how are you making sure you're making space? And also, how are you making sure that space is actually accessible? Are they able to join the meeting online? Is there an interpreter? Is there accommodation needs? And how can you proactively provide those things so the burden is not on the person with disability just to be able to show up to the space?
Awesome. Thank you too for these answers. And now we have a definition and we know that there are personal things we can do. I'd like to turn to some questions. And very exciting, we actually have questions for some individual panelists too. So I'd like to start with those. A question for Zoie. What has the response been from your medical school officials or other students and professors when it comes to highlighting accessibility issues or finding areas where discussions need to be held?
Ooh, what a question. I will say I am incredibly blessed to go to one of the biggest medical schools in the country that is very aimed at social justice and addressing many of the isms that impact patients. And we don't do it when it comes to ableism. That's the one we've left out. So I feel incredibly blessed to be at a school that at least has a starting point. But the amount of time we spend learning about disability is abysmal. It's when I added it up a few weeks ago, so far, I'm about to enter the clinic in about a month. And so far I've spent about 5 hours total talking about explicitly disability. And one of those was in a session that I wrote and led. So the conversation needs to expand majorly. When it comes to the accessibility of the school itself, that has been an incredible challenge. And I have invested so much time in defending myself and figuring out how to exist in this school and succeed with its current policies, that I actually had to delay step one of my boards by almost 2 months because I've cost myself so much time. Just to give an example, and I want to give an example because I also think it speaks to all of these issues we've been talking about, like don't put all the burden on the disabled person, ask questions, learn before you make a mistake, don't make change only dependent on complaint processes, etc. In medicine, there are these things called high fidelity mannequins, which are basically very expensive pretend people that you practice your clinical skills on. And we had a lecture where we were using the mannequin to do something. And I arrived to the lecture and was told that I couldn't enter my normal door because it was next to the mannequin. And they didn't want high traffic flow next to this very expensive equipment. And I said, I need to go in this door because the other door is up like 25 stairs, and not even on a good day can I do that many stairs. And the person said, wait, what? No, you need to go in this door. And I said, I have a disability, I can't. And she looked me up and down and said, I don't understand. I'm gonna have to get someone else. And so at this point, there's a crowd gathering. I have tears prickling my eyes. And that's as someone who like does this work. Like I knew what my rights were, I knew what needed to happen, etc. And she pulled over someone else who I had, worked with in the past. They let me into the room, but I also got pulled aside and told that I could have been more gentle in my explanation to the first person, that I didn't need to get so worked up. Essentially, it was turned into a lesson in resilience. So I called the director of the Disability Resource Center, and I had to spend an hour of my time explaining to her what happened. Not to mention I had to repeat the lecture later on the recording system because I'd been so shaken up I didn't process anything. Then I had to spend an hour in a meeting with the people who had done this thing, and then an hour with the director of medical student learning environments to teach them what had gone wrong, only to get a phone call telling me, well, your letter of accommodation should say you can't take stairs. No, it shouldn't, because that is what the ADA says, is that no classroom can be put somewhere that it's not accessible. And so that is one of literally dozens of moments I have had that have been that big and that problematic. One just happened a week ago, and I was up until almost midnight sending emails trying to figure out if I could go to class or not. And so for me, it's not only been the simple fact that people aren't even thinking about disability, because there is an assumption that disabled people are served by medicine. They do not practice medicine. But when I do bring it up, I am viewed as some like whiny crybaby of sorts for pushing for accessibility. And when I am finally given a seat at the table to explain what should have happened differently, I am up against not only the emotions of the whole situation, I am up against a deep-seated medical model that says the body is the problem, the setting, the lack of elevator, the whatever is not. And so I'm really starting from the get-go with basic disability 101 at every corner I turn in medical school. So to go back to the question, the responses have not always been receptive. They have most often been harmful, particularly from administration, but sometimes from fellow students, almost never from patients. Patients are usually excited that I understand what it means to have been on the other side.
Thank you very much for sharing. And a similar question for Teresa, but in the space of your expertise with working with companies on accessibilities. And someone's curious, Teresa, whether you found the nonprofit or government space any better or perhaps further along than Fortune 500 companies.
Oh, that's a tough one. I think there's work to still be done all around. I would say it's about evenly split. I think the nonprofit and government communities have been maybe perhaps more empathetic and understanding and a little bit further on their disability inclusion journey, but there's still obstacles to be faced there too. I would just say the biggest one that I think is an obstacle in the workplace is just understanding accommodations and the cost of them. I think that's probably an uphill battle across the board, no matter what industry, nonprofit, government, or private sector, just because there's this misconception that, you know, accommodations are going to be super expensive and there's a fear about them. And so there's a lot of education needed that a greater innovation called the Job Accommodations Network that we partner with really does to help educate people on how many accommodations that are needed and helping people get beyond that burden or fear of that burden if they're going to be placed on if a person with disability requests accommodation to utilize their services.
Thank you. A question for Anna. Towards the beginning, someone shared in the chat a Washington Post article about your work in DC. Congrats. And they're curious if there's anything more about your work in this space that you could share.
Sure. So I am a commissioner in DC, which means I'm elected to this advisory neighborhood commission. I have about 2,000 constituents. A lot of my work, because I live in historic Georgetown and am a wheelchair user, centers around physical access, on making the environment fit the person. I do a lot of pushback to, you know, historic preservation ideas about, well, in the 1700s, this building didn't have a ramp. And I'm saying, yes, and in the 1700s, disabled people couldn't get in. And so maybe we should fix that and resolve that now. And this really interesting sort of dynamic of, well, just because that was acceptable 300 years ago, doesn't mean it should be acceptable now, that we should accept these injustices. And I also worked a lot on vaccine prioritization, which is what that article was about for people with disabilities here in DC as well as across the country. Even though we thought that disabled people were going to be at the top of the list due to the fact that we were dying disproportionately from COVID, due to both like actual high risk biological vulnerabilities and neglect by the medical system. But we were instead towards the end of the list. For example, here in DC, we were deprioritized 3 times, moved farther down the line, behind journalists, behind private practice lawyers, behind teachers who were not teaching in person. And it was really frustrating because our community, people were dying every day. And I was really lucky to be able to change that within the government and get us reprioritized towards the beginning of March. But it's hard, you know, we're fighting up against these ideologies of capitalism and eugenics that say, well, those people aren't the valuable ones. They should just stay home and hope that they don't die. And even if they do, you know, they weren't cut out to make it anyway. And these are all ideas which we need to interrogate. And they're really kind of just ideological and made up by, again, people in power. So I spend a lot of time in government kind of trying to push back against those ideas that aren't really serving our community.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And in our last moment, and I'll have Zoe go first because I know she's got to drop off in just a moment. One of this year's finalists said, the social justice needs are so great. Where do we begin? That is a big question, but since we only have a moment, the response needs to be small if possible. So do you have a tweet or thought or snippet to share towards that big question to end our discussion today? And Zoe, if you want to start so you can head out for your medical school training.
Thanks. The biggest thing I would say is be willing to ask questions and be willing to ask people about their experiences, be willing to ask questions and seek answers from authors, bloggers. There's so many disabled people sharing their stories readily, and be willing to ask also for feedback from folks about what you can do to be more accessible and to be anti-ableist. Yeah, be willing to constantly be asking and seeking answers and recognizing there won't always be a clear-cut answer.
Thank you, Zoe. Teresa?
I do have to head out right now, so I'm just going to say thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you, Jory. I'm going to throw my email in the chat in case anyone wants to talk more since I'm hopping off early, but I'm really grateful to share this space.
No, you are hopping off on time, and we're going to wrap up momentarily too. Thank you very much, Zoe. Teresa, do you have a brief response to this question too?
Sure. I just would echo what Zoe said. It just centered around just actively be anti-ableist, which involves learning what that is, learning our community, and amplifying the voices in our community that are speaking for ourselves. And then lastly, just constantly be questioning who is not in the room, what identity group, what form of diversity, you know, what form of just human beings are not being represented in every single space that you're in.
And Anna?
Yeah, I think the great thing about this is that you don't have to start. Like, the answer of where to start is that you don't have to start. A lot of other people have already started a lot of things. And the great thing is that you can just jump on board. You can just be another body, another voice pushing the narrative of a disabled person who's doing fantastic work, who maybe has a nonprofit or is doing some sort of project. So my advice would be, don't start from ground zero. Like, definitely find a project that you like, use Google, great, and see how you can support that in your own capacity.
Thank you. And you stole my answer, Anna, because my answer was the work has begun. So we should all ask, how can I help? Thank you very much for participating in this conversation with me. And I'd love to pass it back to Dr. Terry to close out our discussion and panel this afternoon.
Great, thanks, Jory. And thank you, Anna, Zoe, Teresa, for this really important discussion. This was a fantastic hour. We could have continued very easily for a whole nother hour. These are conversations we're going to be continuing together and ideally moving beyond dialogue to action. I particularly appreciated you guys speaking to the disability rights versus disability justice effort. So thank you for putting that on everyone's radar. There's some great resources shared in the chat. And again, I know this community well enough to be an action-oriented one, so you'll be continuing these conversations and joining forces with one another. I'm also really excited to remind you guys that How to Be Human is available wherever books are sold, so watch for that. I have no doubt there will be some rave reviews that we'll be seeing, and we're always keen to shine a light on Truman authors. So Jory, congratulations again. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Please watch your inboxes in early May as we'll convene our next Speaking with Friends on May 20th, when we'll hear from the ever wonderful, brilliant Yale professor Monica Bell, who I know a lot of you know and love. She'll be discussing police reform. And I hope you'll join us. So with that, thank you for being with us. Take good care. And this concludes today's program. Bye, everyone.